Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fish Tank. It is Minion Masters meta time, or as the cool kids say, So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the meta this season and see what we can to glean from that information. So whether you're looking to build decks to go with the meta or against the meta, this should give you some good information. Now, just a little bit of a recap on my process regarding this video and how the process has evolved. This is going to be our third video, our first MMM Minion Masters Meta review video. Now, the first one, I simply took screenshots of the leaderboard, so solos, pre-mates, and randoms at one period of time. So that gave us 150 decks, sort of halfway through the season. And then I manually put the decks into a spreadsheet, and then we grabbed the information we could from that. So a good start, but a little bit too manual. So my friend Zeus and I, we put together some computer vision software that allowed us to simply take screenshots of the decks, throw them into our software, and then it would spit out the detected cards and the decks, and then we could just put that into the spreadsheet, and that made things a lot easier. So the second video we did last month, we used that automation software, but again, we only took screenshots on one particular time. So that was 150 decks that we looked at for both the first and the second video. But I thought, going further, now we had this sort of semi-automation set up, it'd be better to get more use out of it. So what I did this time is I extended our automation software so that it could detect wildcards and what wildcards were used. So it could fully tell us what the cards in the deck were. And then, instead of taking a screenshot at one particular time and giving us 150 decks, I took screenshots of the leaderboards every single day for 20 days. So that meant that instead of analysing 150 decks, we're now looking at 3,000 decks. So that should give us a much better overview of the system. And I've also been using the Windows Power Automate tool, which actually makes it a lot easier to automate the taking the screenshots. So it's a lot easier to set up. So now, for our third Minion Masters meta video, we should have a much better process, a much bigger data set, and hopefully we can get some better information. Now, we need to remember, of course, that we're going to be comparing what we've got in this patch, 1.48, to the last one, 1.47, when we only had a lot fewer decks analysed. So we need to take that into account and just remember that. But going forward, we should have more and more data to get more and more information from it. But anyway, that's just a recap of what's been going on behind the scenes. But let's have a look at the data that we've managed to grab from this. Right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the master popularity. So let's start with solos. So this is our graph, our pie chart from last season, 1.47. As you can see, APEP dominating with 24%. Rekt and Morelia and Valorian closing out the top four. Now let's compare that to what we've seen this season in solos, and we see a pretty big uptick in Morelia. Morelia has been the most played, at least according to the leaderboards. One thing we need to remember is this is just leaderboard data. This is not, we don't have direct sort of win percentage information, but we can kind of, the fact that we're looking at leaderboard decks, we can assume that they're decent decks, right? So this is not overall. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that data, but this is what we can glean from the leaderboard. So Morelia is now the most played solo master. APEP dropping down from 24% last season down to just 13.7%. So that seems healthier, and some potential more nerfs on the way for APEP in the next patch. Rekt again up there, Volko having an uptick. So interesting to see that APEP's not being played quite so much, and that Morelia certainly is. Right, so that's solos, and if we have a look at the average mana cost, it's gone up a little bit, but when we're talking about sort of deck building and thinking about average mana cost, we're thinking about, you know, between 3 and 4.5. 3 as a super cheap cycle deck, 4.5 more of a heavier deck. But anywhere between that, and as you can see, the average mana cost of the leaderboard decks does reflect that quite nicely. Right, so that's the master popularity in solos. Let's have a look at how that is in 2v2 randoms. So again, looking at last season, Morelia dominating 28%, very, very strong. APEP and Stormbringer, and then Volko. Now, this season, APEP has overtaken Morelia. So APEP is the first with 26%. Morelia dropping down a little bit, but a pretty big uptick there for Setsu, and Stormbringer also there or thereabouts. Plus Mordor, as we see there, the pinkish kind of color, more Mordor plays. So interesting to see that Morelia is the master of choice in solos, but not in randoms. APEP still is that case. Again, if we look at the average mana cost, again, not much has changed. 3.7 up to 3.8. Okay, so the last thing to look at regarding master popularity is 2v2 pre-mades. And again, last season, APEP hugely dominant, 32%, and again, Morelia in second place. This season, Stormbringer. Stormbringer last season was at 6%, now he's at 21%. A huge Stormbringer uptick in pre-mates. APEP is in second place, 20%, dropped quite a bit, and again, Morelia still there or thereabouts. So in all the modes, APEP and Morelia very strong, but Stormbringer having a huge uptick in pre-mades. Why is that? Not entirely sure. I think one of the reasons you might see Stormbringer more in pre-mades than you do in randoms is that a lot of the Stormbringer decks need a support deck with it. So whether that's a deck with a lot of tanks, a lot of like Guardians, things like that. Which of course in pre-mades you can build that with your teammate and you can have perfectly working together decks, where in randoms you can't guarantee that. So very interesting to see a huge uptick in Stormbringer there, and Diona, the orange, still there or thereabouts. And again, mana cost 3.8 hasn't changed, and again it follows along with our deck building guidelines. Just a reminder, I did make a deck building video, so if you want to check that out, there'll be a link somewhere for that. Right, so master popularity. I think it's interesting, just as a final thought on that, it's interesting and it's healthy that APEP is not so dominant as APEP was previously. So whether that's talking about Morelia in solos or Stormbringer in pre-mates, it's interesting to see that it's not just APEP across the board. Right, next up we'll have a look at the rarity composition. So of course here we're talking about the rarity of the cards, whether that's common, rare, supreme or legendary. A lot of new players, as we've said many times before, assume that legendary cards are better and that more legendaries is more better. But of course, as we can see here, it's not the case. As always, a majority of the decks are made up with common cards, the least rare cards. And one thing to really confirm or clarify regarding rarity in Minion Masters is the rarer a card, the more unique a card is. So whether that has a unique ability, something like that, that's really what legendary means, as opposed to being stronger. And as you can see here, the decks are hugely specifically common, and then it's almost 50% common, right? So I think this is a real eye-opener for new players. Experienced players will know this. They will know common cards are very, very strong. But I think this is really interesting for new players to realise that it is not about who has the most legendaries. And just as a, it'd be remiss of me to not mention, this game is clearly not pay to win. Right, and we see the graphs underneath for 1.47. I know they're kind of small, you can't really read the thing, but the colours hopefully make sense. And as you can see, not really much has changed. Right, next up we're going to look at the faction composition. So, how many factions have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Is there 9 factions overall? 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, it looks like we've got 9 factions overall. So let's have a look here. Solos dominated kind of by Voidborn. I think that's specifically due to the resurgence of Korgoth decks. So that's why we're seeing a lot of Voidborns there. So Voidborn, Scrat, and Outlander, the top 3, followed by Empyrean in solos. It's changed a little bit from last season, but again, Voidborn and Scrat, the top 2. Now in randoms, huge swing here from Accursed. Accursed was almost 25% of the cards in random decks, on average, were Accursed. As we can see here, Accursed is the dark green, and we're looking at the randoms, which is in the middle. That has dropped down from 25% last season to only 11% this season. So a big reduction in Accursed. What can we know we've seen, if we think about the reasoning behind that, we think about the nerfs. We did have some nerfs in the most recent patch to some Accursed things. Remember, Unholy Ground had the immobilization removed. Undying Skeleton got nerfed. Harmful Souls got nerfed. So this could be an offshoot of that. So this season in random, Scrat and Voidborn and then Outlander are the top 3. And then if we close out this part of our discussion by looking at pre-mades, last season Voidborn, Scrat and Accursed, but again we see this time a huge reduction again in Accursed in pre-mades. If we just quickly look back to 1v1, there was also a reduction in Accursed there. So a reduction in Accursed across the board. Is Accursed bad now? I don't think so. It's just not as strong as it used to be. But one thing to really notice here about the pre-mades on the right, there is a big uptick in Outlanders. Outlanders, nearly 20% of cards are Outlander cards in pre-mades. So remember, some of these factions, they sort of fit into all sorts of decks, whereas some of them are very much they want to be in almost an entire faction deck, like Accursed or a lot of the Outlander cards. So that's something to bear in mind. So a big uptick in Outlander. Voidborn's still very prominent across the board, as are Scrats. Right, so that's our faction composition. And then we're going to have a look at our wildcard usage. Of course, no wildcards in solos. Why is the graph there? I don't know. Just seemed rude to not include it. But one thing to notice here is the use of wildcards has increased in both randoms and pre-mades. So 80% of decks had no wildcards last season in randoms, only 68% this time, and again, similar figures in pre-mades. So more being wildcarded. And whether that's 1 or 2 wildcards. And if we consider the most wildcarded cards in randoms, that's Scrap Pack, Walking Blind Date, Aimbot, Elite Swarmer, Guardian, and Doom Cleaver. And in pre-mades, Crystal Archers, Morgrel's Mark, Scotty, Drone Buzzers, and Lost Legionnaires. Okay, so more wildcards across the board. Why is that? No idea. But of course, remember, we've got way more data this season to look at than last season. We only had one snapshot, so keep that in mind. Right, let's have a look at the top cards. This is really important when you're thinking about building decks. Decks need cards. Good cards are better than bad cards. So let's see what the good cards are. So we're going to look at the top cards. These are non-spell cards. That means that anything that's not a spell. So basically minions or buildings. We have, thanks for, I can't remember, was it Loki that gave me the feedback about having some kind of key legend to help make this easier to understand? Thanks for that feedback. I took it on board. So we have 4 icons you'll see here. Green arrow for the rank increase. The red rank decrease. That's based on last season compared to this season. Whether it's a new entry in our top 9 or whether it's a card in the same rank. Is that confusing? Let's make it more obvious here. Okay, so let's have a look at the top cards in solos. So, Elite Swarmer, that's gone up from last season. Stint, again, that's gone up from last season. And Rocket Scrat, gone up from last season. Aimbot is a new entry. Scrap Pack is a new entry. Netherbats is a new entry. Annihilator is a new entry. We've got the Assassin still there, but not as highly ranked as before, and a new entry of the Plasma Marines. So one thing to note is, of course, if we've got new entries, that means things have dropped out. What has dropped out? Well, from this season compared to last season, no Blood Imps in the top 9. They've dropped to 15th. Crossbow Dudes, they've dropped to 12th. Tantrum Throwers, they've dropped to 30th. Jolo's dropped to 17th. And the Heal Puff just out of the top 9 in 10th. So kind of a big change here in solos, but the cards at the top, if you're building a deck and you don't start by putting in an Elite Swarmer and a Stint, then you're almost doing something wrong, regardless of the game mode. Right, let's have a look how things are in 2v2 randoms. So again, we've got the Elite Swarmer. That's in the same position as it was last season. Same with the Walk-in Blind Date. And again, Stint's there and higher than it was before. Cleaver is a new entry. Whirly Scrat's a new entry. Crossbow Dudes still there from last season. Grenadiers dropped down. Scrap Pack is a new entry, and Swarmers are a new entry. And of course, what comes in, something has to go out. So we've lost Cursebearer. That's dropped down to 11. So only a small reduction there. Lost Legionnaires, they've dropped down heavily to 27th. I think that probably means we've had less Empyrean decks this season. Undying Skeleton, remember that got nerfed in the last patch. That's dropped out of the top 9 down to 51st. So he's dropped substantially. And the Warrior has dropped out of the top 9 down to 24th. Right, and then let's close this section out with looking at our 2v2 pre-mades. So again, Elite Swarmers at the top, and it's still at the top. Same with Stint. Plasma Marines are a new entry. Stint and Plasma Marines go really well together, generating the tech. Swarmers dropping down a little bit. Whirly Scrat's a new entry. Rocket Scrat there from last season. Scrap Pack is a new entry. Walk-in Blind Date, still there but dropped down a little bit. And a new entry of the Vulture Prime. And let's have a look at what dropped out of our top 9. Cursebearer dropped down to 17th. Defensor Chopper dropped down to 11th. Grenadier down to 26th. And Jolo down to 22nd. Okay, so if you're looking for some good, solid cards to throw in your deck, you can see exactly what's going on here, what's very, very good at the top. And of course, if you're a new player and you're thinking about crafting cards, this gives you a good idea of what cards are really, really good to craft. And a good thing about a lot of these cards, and this is the reason why they are so far at the top, is they're sort of very generic cards in general. They can almost fit in any deck. Whereas you've got some cards that are very, very deck specific. And of course, that limits how often we're going to see them overall. Right, so those are our top cards. Next up, we're going to look at our top spells. So previously it was minions or buildings. This is spells. And as you would probably imagine, one of the new cards this season, very, very strong card, likely to get nerfed in the next patch, Morgrul's Mark. That is the most played 1v1 card, and it was played almost 2.5 times more than Daggerfall in second place. So not only was it the most played card in solos, it was the most played card by a long, long way in solos. Okay, so Morgrul's Mark, new entry, Daggerfall, it's gone up. Scritillery, it's gone up. Scrat, Bridge Buddy, is a new entry. Beam of Doom still there but dropped down. Same with Chain Lightning, same with Impetus Blast. We've got Frostfeather Flyby, and interestingly, we've got Gorex Sacrifice. What did we lose from last season? Once Bidden dropped out of the top. Remember, there was a recent nerf to Werewolves with their HP dropping down. Once Bidden dropped out of the top 9 down to 31st. Unholy Ground dropped out of the top 9, only down to 12th. But remember, again, that's partially due at least, to the removal of the immobilization. But Unholy Ground, of course, does things that nothing else can do. So even if it gets nerfed, it's still likely to feature. What else do we have? Restless Dead dropping down to 14th. And Bearvalanche dropping down to 11th. So I think what we'll see with a lot of these spells compared to last season is there's going to be a lot less accursed spells in our top 9. And as we've seen before when we looked at the factions, a lot less accursed cards in general being played. And we know that accursed decks tend to be a faction entire deck, so that means just a lot of less of these entire accursed Ascension decks. Right, so that's our top spells in solos. Let's have a look at our top spells in randoms. So again, Morgrul's Mark, it's a new entry and it's right at the top. Not quite as dominant as it was in solos, but still the most played spell. Bridge Buddies is there and it is going up. We've got the Beam of Doom a little higher than it was before. Chain Lightning a little lower. Bearvalanche is a new entry. We've got Rimagal's Breath, which I think if you've played at all this season in duos, that's definitely a spell you would have seen quite a lot. And I think it didn't get a buff fairly recently, so it's probably off the back of that. Unholy Ground dropping down. Daggerfall, a new entry, and Howling Moon dropping down. And of course, let's have a look at what dropped out of our top 9 from last season. Harmful Souls dropping down to 17th, Nirvir's Breath dropping down to 13th, Toll of the Dead dropping down to 11th. So they're all accursed cards. So, you know, they kind of rise and fall together a lot of the time. And finally, Corpse Explosion dropping down to 21st. So that's 4 cards that dropped out of our top 9, and they were all accursed cards. I'm not unhappy about that. Right, and then close out our top spells by looking at pre-mades. Beam of Doom is the removal spell of choice, and it is still the removal spell of choice, as it was last season. We've got Chain Lightning going up a little bit. Morgul's Mark's there, but only 3rd, not quite as dominant. Not really sure why that is. Maybe people in pre-mades are better at dealing with it, so people don't play it so much. Unsure. Daggerfall's still there. Bridge Buddy's dropping down a little bit. Again, we've got the Rimmergul's Breath. Avalanche going up a little bit. Dragon Ball. FDM will be happy to see that. Yeah, that's a new entry. And, of course, Impetus Blast in there. What have we dropped out of our top spells for pre-mades this season compared to last season? Howling Moon's dropped to 12th. Unholy Grounds dropped to 15th. Harmful Souls dropped to 27th. And Nirvir's Breath dropped to 21st. Again, a lot of accursed spells dropping out of our top 9. Right, so those are the top spells. Now, one of the things that new players always ask, what's the best legendary? They are desperate to get their hands on legendaries, and they want to know what are the best. Now, just a reminder, as we looked at the rarity composition earlier, legendaries doesn't necessarily mean better, and you don't have decks just full of legendaries, but legendaries are generally cool, and they often have specific mechanics that allow you to build cool decks and strats around them. So let's have a look at our top legendaries. So looking at solos, Scotty is our top legendary, and that's a new entry. He wasn't there before. Jolo's dropped down. He was our legendary of choice last season in solos, not anymore. Jinglong, again, still there, but dropping down. Azog, and as we mentioned before about having a lot of Voidborn cards in solos, that's because we've had a lot of Korgoth decks, and as you see, Korgoth here is in our top 9. Ardera dropping down a little bit, but still there. Same with Shield Captain Avea. Chisma Boomstick comes in, and our 9th place card this season and last season is the Snake Druid. What have we lost? We lost the Musketeer down to 17th. He got a little nerf. Howling Moon, again, remember all of the Dwarves got nerfed with their HP, so Howling Moon felt that a little bit, dropping down to 12th. Corpse Explosion dropping down to 16th, and Herald Our Moon dropping out of the top 9 to 25th. Right, let's have a look at randoms. So, our top legendary in randoms is Zip's Zapinator. Jolo is 2nd, as it was last season. Howling Moon again dropping down a little bit. Ruby, Siege Imperator. Ruby, let's just call it Ruby, is there in 4th place. Jinlong, Xiaolong, Lady and Frey, all still in the top 9, but shifting positions a little bit. Rekinator is a new entry, and Wheel of Doom is a new entry. Now, what have we lost in randoms? Corpse Explosion dropping down to 14th, Razor Squadron dropping down to 22nd, and TAS dropping out at the top 9 down to 32nd. So we're seeing, at least in some of the modes, a curse falling out of favour, as well as some Outlander cards. Now, again, let's have a look at 2v2 pre-mades. The legendaries, again, Zip is top. Ruby there, still 2nd, as they were last season. Jolo dropping down a little bit. Scotty, a new entry. Laylel, a new entry. Lady and Frey, a new entry. We've got the Arcane Bolt. Simulacrum, again, new entries. And Howling Moon dropping down a little bit. So quite a lot of crystal cards there. Which is, I think, when we looked at the Masters, Stormbringer was pretty strong in pre-maze. And it's Stormbringer, Crystal, Elfbringer, whatever you want to call it, seems to be the order of the day there. And of course, one of the most wildcarded cards was Crystal Archers. Right, so what do we lose from our top 9 for pre-mades? Corpse Explosion dropped out down to 20th, Fergus dropped out down to 32nd, Gax down to 16th, Mardred down to 24th, Snake Druid down to 26th, and Bara down to 13th. So a lot of changes there in pre-made. So if you're a new player and you want to figure out what is the best legendary, you can't really go wrong with any of these. Some of these are going to be really generic legendaries that you can kind of play in any deck, whereas others are going to be very deck specific. So I always advise a new player, if they're going to choose, if they want a legendary, it's best to choose something that allows you to play it in many, many different types of decks. So for example, Jolo. One of the reasons Jolo here is so high is because you can play Jolo in many, many different types of decks, right? Whereas some of the other ones are going to be very deck specific. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers everything that we wanted to cover today in this video. So hopefully that gives you a good insight into what the meta is this season, what sort of masters, what sort of cards are most played, and which ones are doing the best on the leaderboard. One thing I do want to mention is I'm always interested to look at how we can improve this. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about these meta videos? And if you have any ideas of what other things we could look at to get more information. As mentioned, we're looking at a lot more decks, 3,000 decks this season as opposed to 150 last season. So huge amount more data. And of course, extrapolating interesting things from that data is always interesting, but it's also, you've got to kind of cut you've got to make a mark in the sand somewhere, right? You can pull all sorts of data out, but what is the most interesting and useful data? Let me know what you think, and also let me know if you agree with what these what we've showed, what information we've got here. Because remember, we're looking at leaderboard decks, and this may or may not represent stuff lower down, but you know, we have to get what data we can. So I think it's pertinent to look at the leaderboards and to talk about what is the most powerful. You know, the strats that work at the top level might not work so well at lower level, vice versa. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to cover today. But yeah, let me know what you think of the stuff that we've got over. Always interested to hear what you think, any feedback, especially on how we can make this better. If you're enjoying the content here in the Fish Tank, of course, hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date on all things Minion Masters related. And as always, I'm bad as fish, and wherever I am, and wherever you are, hopefully we're awkwardly waving.